whether you are joining us online on our Zoom, or perhaps you're actually joining us on our Facebook page. Thank you so much. We hope you'll enjoy this afternoon's conversation. And this webinar is really supposed to be the people's vision of rural tenure, and it's insights that come from the Communal Land and Administration Tenure Summit convened by government in May this year. But more broadly, it is also a conversation with a number of conversation starters who have been generous and gracious enough to join us. So to kick off, I'll just tell you that I am Tshepo Fukani from the Alliance for Rural Democracy. We are a cross-section of academics, NGOs, grassroots structures, attorneys, whose focus has been on the former Bantustans. And obviously our key areas, summary, would be land, mining, and rural governance. Joining us in this conversation, we have conversation starters, and some of them, what a privilege and honor it is to introduce them. Kicking off with the conversation, we have Ms. Nomboniso Gasa, a feminist, researcher, writer, political analyst, and an activist. She has an incredibly unique contribution that she's made to academic work, policy reform, activism, and really has taken many, many years, dating back all the way to the 1990s to present day, to bring her voice to really important conversations. She is very much widely published, cited, known, has done incredible work, more than anything, in highlighting, amplifying women, rural women, our role, our work, and what it is that we contribute to society. Alongside her is Ms. Ayanda Ngubo, who is an attorney and a partner at Weber Wenzel's Pro Bono division. Ms. Ngubo is not just coming to us from Weber Wenzel, she's also a trustee for the Rural Democracy Trust. And so that means that our trust really has trustees that are people who've lived and worked, this issue around, people's vision and making sure that we amplify voices from below. Ayanda, obviously now is a practicing attorney. She's worked at SANEC. She has also returned back to Weber Wenzel in a different role, but these are not issues that are new to her because she does have an extensive history and focus on CPAs and trusts and communal land holding entities. And then rounding up our conversation is Mr. Muladelo Mohale, joining us from Nguzi Development Association, where he's a program officer. Nguzi is actually based in Limpopo, and it's one of the most prolific NGOs you'll find. It's because of Nguzi many years ago that today people living on the land are entitled to legal services, because Nguzi took on the state and said, we cannot allow, in this instance, farm owners to have access to legal services, but people on the land should just fend for themselves and won't be able to defend their evictions. In addition, Muladelo is a writer, so I hope you're going to search him and read up on his extensive work. And he has several years of experience under his belt. This conversation, more than anything, is supposed to be informative and fun, and more than anything, push us towards an action point to say, we have seen many developments over the years on communal tenure. And at times, the state has missed the mark, and at times civil society and activists on the ground have had to step in and do more. So I just want to remind everyone of a bit of housekeeping, that you should please use the Q&A function to ask questions. Let's engage with utmost respect for one another. Anyone who is struggling can use the transcription services. We only have transcription in English. And without wasting much time, I will now introduce Ms. Nomboniso Gasa and ask her to talk us through some of the reflections These reflections, of course, is something that the ARD commissioned and asked Nomboniso to pen for us, because we had activists and others who attended the session in May and walked away feeling, you know, interested, confused, maybe inspired, maybe frustrated. And we thought, let's have a conversation, not just with ourselves, but with many important voices in the space. And Nomboniso, over to you.
Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be talking to you today and sharing my observations and my reflections, first and foremost, of the Communal Land Tenure Summit in May, and more broadly, the journey that has been very unsuccessful of securing communal land tenure in South Africa. From the onset, I would like to salute Mamusizani today, this being the Women's Month, the beginning of the Women's Month. I would like to greet everybody who has been part of this journey, particularly the women who have been at the forefront of this struggle, as well as many others. I think it is important that we pay tribute to all these women, but remember, most importantly, our recently departed beloved Mamusizani. When I was at the Communal Land Summit, and afterwards, when I was thinking about the Land Summit, a number of questions that I asked myself. The first one was, what exactly is the problem? Where are we? Why are we here? I realized that all the
Hi, Ma'am Nomboniso. I'm sorry to stop you for a bit. We've lost your sound. I'm not sure what happened. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So I think for me, it's important that we restate the question, because misrepresenting the question and distorting it as often presented as issues around empowering traditional leaders and opposed by internationally funded and middle-class activists and so on. I think it misleads the conversation. The second point is that I think that the communal land tenure in particular touches a number of issues that we have not really confronted in South Africa. So that's what I'm going to run through very quickly. Before I proceed, I didn't catch the time that I have. How much time do you want me to talk? Hello?
Hi, Mama. If we can keep it between 15 to 20 minutes, that would be great.
Okay. I think in the first instance, it's important that we ask the question, what is the problem? How did this problem arise? Why is it still the problem? And how do we get out of this situation? Many activists, progressive scholars and committed historians have written quite a lot about South Africa's land question and have gone into a detailed analysis and historical overview of how the land question began. They take it to pre-1915 and to right to the present. I think our starting point has got to be understanding how the land question and the different facets of how it became, how it was done, but most importantly, how it has impacted people. There's a tendency, particularly of politicians, as we saw at the Communal Land Tenure Summit, to talk only about the colonial and apartheid era. And in many ways, if we listened to the politicians when they were speaking, all of them, from the deputy president to the ministers who presented and to the deputy presidents, as well as traditional leaders, there's a sense that they haven't played any role. It's as if when they talk about the land, the problems, when they talk about problems at the Communal Land Tenure Summit in May, it was as if the last 20 years haven't really existed, and that government has not really had the mandate of the constitution and election to try and deal with that legacy. The second point at the Land Summit was almost looking at politicians who are empowered to make decisions and who have made decisions and very specific choices, and repositioning themselves in terms of how they presented their talks, as if they are still part of people who are in the quest for liberation in the struggle. To start with, the communal land tenure has been very much pitted as if it is an issue that affects traditional leaders as well as people who live in these communities, without looking at how, in fact, it is in the center of the land reform, redistribution, and rebuilding of the land question in South Africa. So the issue is not between traditional leaders and activists and communities in these areas. The issue is between an insecure communal land tenure system that government has failed to reform and the constitution. The issue is at the core of the promise, the South African Constitution, that promises freedom, that promises equality, that promises common citizenship and common and equal citizenship for everyone. It is about undoing and unraveling the way in which land dispossession and alienation came about in South Africa. So yes, we look at all that history, which has been written very eloquently by many scholars, but we need to understand why is it that this history is difficult. A number of scholars, Aninka Claessens, Ben Cousins, Nolundi Luwaya, and Sindisa Mnisi-Weeks, and many others, have argued that part of it is about understanding what communal tenure is about. It's about a society that has been shaped by colonial conquerors and apartheid oppressors in an image that was easy for colonialists to understand and control. So it's about a history that has been so deeply embedded that even that which is familiar to the oppressed, to us, the oppressed and the colonized, has been distorted and then given back to us as in a package that is completely unrecognized. how do we see this in the way in which traditional leaders understand their role, in the way in which we understand what a traditional leader is. We see this in the way in which we understand our families, in ways in which we understand familial relationships and the hierarchies in families. Most of us have heard our parents talk about who is the head of the family, and those of us who want to have a better, different and more inclusive family argue that no head can be on its own. You need the neck to help the head to communicate with the body. But what we need to ask is, where does this notion of a singular person having so much power and control in patriarchal family? And if we look at this, we will see that this notion of a monarch and monarchism that relies on individual and supreme being in terms of law and status is very much a legacy of apartheid and colonialism. So everything from the home to the village to the district and all these things have been centered around this person or these few people who have power, and then everything else trickles down. Their power trickles down to everybody. So these scholars have argued that, but our systems are not like that. That our systems are about sharing responsibility, are about co-owning responsibility, and about redistributing responsibility and power and resources, even at the level, starting at the level of the family. So us who want to see communal land tenure changing in South Africa, we really have to start by contesting these notions of customary law that are very top down, these notions of communalism that mean that all the other constituting parts of the communal do not have power, that the power is at the center. The other thing that scholars emphasize is that in our historically in pre-colonial and even to a large extent during colonialism and apartheid, that landholding systems had never been communal, and that's it. That the rights to community and communal and shared coexist with the rights that individuals hold in that. So it's both communal, shared, but it's also, and at the same time, individual. So one of the big mistakes that government has made has been to crudely interpret communal as not belonging to anybody, but belonging to everybody. As a result, they have this notion that there are boundaries, and these boundaries are very strict and they are very strictly defined between what is communal at the private level and what is what is individual, which is at the private level, and what is communal, that is at the community level. So we have to have conversations and present our lived experience, what we know from our own families and communities and cultures, that actually the boundaries are not that strictly defined. It is a Western construct, this notion of boundaries that cannot be interfered with is a very is a legacy of a very possessive notion of ownership and space in Western societies. Because these issues have never really been conversed with by government and politicians that are now in charge of this, this rationale of monarchism, patriarchal centers of power, are not challenged in public discourse. So part of our our responsibility, I want to suggest, is to actually go into these conversations and show, firstly, what the Constitutional Court has been trying to do over time in terms of decisions and rulings that it has made, expanding the notion of customary law, expanding the notion of participation, expanding the notion of common ownership. The first thing that is very clear in the summit is when all the leaders of government and traditional leaders talk about the history. They all talk about, they say, well, the ANC has always been close to traditional leaders, and that traditional leaders have always played a very important role in the struggle. It's important that we begin to tell our stories about this and contest that history. That history is, it silences a whole range of issues. Yes, traditional leaders were part, the institution of traditional leadership was part of the struggle for liberation. Yes, they were very much involved, particularly in the early years of the ANC's, of the formation of the ANC. But it's also important to revisit that history and talk about the way in which the institution of apartheid, the system of apartheid, isolated traditional leaders that were standing with people against oppression. This being the month of August in which we celebrate that those courageous women who marched to Pretoria in 1956, it's important that we remember leaders like Chief Moilo, who was one of the leaders who refused the mandate that came from Verwoerd to tell his wife to carry the pass laws. And thus, through his lot, his power, his influence with the women against the pass laws. We know of such leaders, but we also know what happened to them, that a lot of them were marginalized, they were deprived of their positions as by the state, as apartheid was trying to get leaders, traditional leaders that were malleable to them. So this history is contested, and I'm suggesting that we need to bring these contradictions because it is assumed by people who know and who should know better, who were part of the ANC and the national liberation struggle. It was the way in which apartheid practiced its system of division and oppression. It was to divide and to conquer. There were contradictions between communities as well, communities against the institution of traditional leadership. There were contradictions amongst traditional leaders themselves, and so on. So it never was a simple, straightforward, it's black and it's white, it's this side. It was never, these kind of lines that government seems to, or politicians seem to think exist, that there are strict lines, this side and this side, the left, the right, the progressive, the non-progressive, that the system had permeated and really infected every aspect and every level of our being. When we contest this narrative of traditional leaders who have always stood together with people, we are not denying the fact that some traditional leaders did. We know of the campaigns that led to the formation of Contralesa. We know of like really courageous campaigns by people like Chief Moilo, not just about the pass laws, but also in communities where they helped the ANC to recruit youngsters who are going to go to exile, who are going to go and work some. So in the family, they would say, one son must go and work in the mines, one son must go to exile and all this. So we know that the ANC itself lived amongst the people. The recruitees who went to join Mkhonto weSizwe didn't come from the sky. They came from the communities, assisted by community members. But those traditional leaders, as it happened with Ngosi Albert Lutuli as well, those traditional leaders were largely marginalized. So what we are seeing, part of it, this is the point I'm getting to, is that what we are seeing is the restating and the revisiting of the contradictions that we have within ourselves as African people, but also between ourselves and the state that was represented by the apartheid system. And today, to some extent, between ourselves and the state that we have inherited, despite the constitution, despite the stated objectives of the liberation movement. It's important that when we approach these questions today, it's important that we look at the way in which the damage of apartheid is not only intergenerational, it is also multi-layered, it's multidimensional. There is nothing that you touch that doesn't have, that has not been contaminated. I mean, people who are religious will tell you of massive struggles in communities where African independent churches even were not considered to be Christian. Inkonzo zamaZioni and all of that were not considered to be Christian. These are not struggles that are on the periphery. And these are not struggles that are removed from the land question. These are struggles about defining people, defining a culture, defining people's relationships with land, defining people's relationships with themselves. So I think it's important that as Alliance for Rural Democracy, as people who are affected by these issues, that we go back and we grab this narrative, we reclaim it for ourselves. Finally, I think that we need to restate, as I said, the problem. So here's the problem. One, how we got here. We got here because the ANC didn't, in fact, prepare for what would happen after apartheid amongst Africans. There wasn't as much work preparing for post-apartheid institution of traditional leadership and democracy at community level, as there was, for example, on issues around minority rights, the rights of minorities. You can see that in the Bill of Rights. And you know that the minorities that were envisaged at that stage were mostly from the powerful sectors of society. So white people were very clear, Fanzela Slabat and others were very clear that they were not only going to take people like Albie Sachs's commitments to rights of minorities, but that it had to be drilled down. We never had that. We never had an opportunity to say, yesterday we were against Mangope. What are we going to do now with a state where this legacy exists? So we have work at that level. The second, okay, finally, you want me to cut off, okay. Finally, all the proposals that are put by the communal and tenure policy, by the approach of government and all that, envisages these boundaries that between your home state and your community, there's a fixed boundary. There isn't a fixed boundary. Even these areas that are called outer boundaries, for example, where you would go and where they think that they can have industrial activities, investments, and so on, or even the grazing fields and all of that, they are never separate. And my one last example to show this is, if I go home and I dream of my ancestors and I have to do something for my ancestors, and they say, well, you have to go to the river to greet your people in the river and all of
Hi, Ma'am Nambonisa. We've lost your sound again for some reason.
Okay, where did you lose my sound? Okay,
Um,
anyway, I'm finished anyway.
No, I think we'd really like to hear how you explained going home, greeting your ancestors, because it's a reality for all of us, you know.
Yeah, and the thing is, some people, for example, bury in their yards. Some people bury in communal spaces. That graveyard is communal. The edge of the village where some politicians and private business people would see as zones for development and all that. There's a fluid relationship there. So I'm suggesting that part of what we do when we talk about, when we consider what to do, we need to restate the fact that we didn't work through these issues and get clarity during transition. So even though the law, the constitution is very clear, so section 25(6) is very clear on this. And post 1994, a number of constitutional judgments around deepening these rights are very clear. But the politicians have not worked through this. So the ANC as a political project doesn't fully grasp what is at stake here, because the ANC as a political project has allowed itself to take the notions of customary law, of custom, of culture, of neighborly relationships. They've allowed themselves to take those notions as defined through the legacy of apartheid and colonialism. So that's part of what we need to do. The third thing that we need to do is to restate what the Constitution says about these kinds of about these rights, that these rights are inalienable. So if section 25(6) says a person or community, so that means each and every person in that community who's going to be affected by that decision has got to be consulted, has got to be part of the conversation. So this notion of politicians as representatives of people, it's important, they can make decisions, but the Constitution requires that all of us actually make these decisions. And I think when we discuss later about CPAs and trust and all that, we will have this conversation, because it doesn't really matter what structure is put in. The issue are the principles that we have to restate. We need to restate these principles, that these rights are inalienable and that we cannot transfer our mandate to representatives. Finally, I think that we need to look at this as a political project that we campaign for, and we restate the issues as a political project. We revisit how we want to engage with the public, with government and all that, because unfortunately, the decisions that are made in court are not necessarily being filtered to how we live our lives. So we need to figure out how we are going to engage with these issues. I haven't made a presentation that focuses on the laws and that focuses on how the apartheid laws affect us today, because I think we've had a lot of those conversations and we have fact sheets on this. I think what is important is to unravel this thing of customary law and this thing of the legacy of the apartheid and colonial, and how many of us even defend these systems because this is what we have been made to believe is the case. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this incredible contribution. I just found my brain and ideas popping off all the time, looking at the past, understanding how we got here was really important in order for us to plan for the future, and having an honest conversation about whether or not the state was actually ever in the right place to lead us in this process and saying, hey, as the people, we have to remember this is our democracy, this is our country. Our inputs, our experiences are vital. And I really feel just so much like what you've touched on goes beyond what happened at the summit. We've seen and understood over the many years traditional leaders saying, and members of Contralesa, we'd like to see land being administered by traditional councils. And it's exactly what you're saying, which is that how would that play out? And more importantly, a lot of the people who we've worked with and women in these areas have always spoken out to say, I might not be protected at household or family level as a person. So thinking of tenure, thinking of this Section 25(6) in a real way is really important. And I'm so excited that these conversations, they may seem old, but they keep being important and relevant because we're looking for the answers. And with that, I'd like to bring in actually Ayanda Ngubo, who will give us some insights, I think also because of her history and her experiences in communal and group landholding. Ayanda?
Thank you so much, Tsepo. And it's so important, the points that Mam Nombonisa has raised, and I was just saying earlier to the team that, I've been out of the space for about 4 years and I just recently came back. And it's so disheartening to realize that we are still dealing with the same issues. The same issues of government failing to understand what exactly is customary law, and the fact that customary law is it's living, it's organic, it's not fixed, and it changes, and the fact that they still do not understand that, the fact that landholding entities like CPAs and trusts are still in the same way that they were 4 years ago, in the sense that there's still no support, no form of support that is being given to these entities by the department. I mean, I've looked at the annual plan of the department and they rave about how much land they've transferred. I mean, land worth about 24 billion rands that has been transferred, that is sitting in trusts and CPAs, but they don't reflect on what type of support and whether those CPAs are really working, are things working? They haven't really reflected on that, and what type of support is being given to CPAs, because we've seen in the past, I mean, we've looked at the Mutlante report, and there's also the high level, the panel that was appointed by the president. The two reports are almost identical in terms of identifying the issues, identifying the problems in communal land tenure, and specifically with regards to CPAs, the dysfunctionality that exists in these structures. And so you begin to wonder whether, is there a will to address these issues? There's a saying that says, where there's a will, there's a way. And so you start to wonder whether, is there a will amongst, our leaders to address these issues? Is there a will to ensure that communities, land is really transferred to communities and not to traditional leaders as they want it to be? So, I mean, we were just before the Supreme Court of Appeal about 2 months ago, I think in May, where we were trying to explain to the Supreme Court of Appeal in the Pondo kingship matter, which has also gone on for years, because at times we find that even our own judicial system may not understand customary law, and so in that matter, we were trying to explain to the Supreme Court of Appeal that how customary law works, that you can't rely on a commission that is set up by government to determine for a community who their traditional leaders should be. You have to take into consideration the views of that community. In this case, for instance, in the Pondo kingship matter, it was clear from the papers that the community had not been consulted. And so it's really, you know, at pains to explain, and really you don't understand whether, like I say, whether there is a will. Tefo. Thank you.
Oh, my apologies. Thank you so much, Ayanda, for that brief but insightful inputs. 24 billion, that blows my mind. Knowing that so many CPAs and trusts immediately after getting land then have to wrestle with debts, water bills, water use licenses, and then find themselves either leasing the land back to white landowners, or portions of the land actually gets auctioned to settle these debts. And what that means is that, in a way, we're working backwards, right? We are using an incredible amount of money from the public budget, and some of that money ends up going backwards. People find themselves in litigation. So post-settlement support, owning, transferring, holding land, the numbers of CPAs and trusts that might actually be dysfunctional, the ones that have been put under administration, the challenges that CPA members have spoken about to say, yes, we are a group, we are the landowners now, we are thankful for that, but there's still this elite group where that committee, in a way, parallels like a traditional council, making the decisions alone, not consulting people, no audited financial statements. The list is endless. In addition to that, I'm really interested in Ayanda's reflection that we do turn to the courts a lot, and she's an attorney saying this, and sometimes the courts struggle. And actually, should we be outsourcing so much power and decision making outside? In reality, some of the challenges or the answers might lie within communities, households, individuals, groups. Yeah, just a lot of thoughts about where are we, where do we come from, and what do we think for the future. But before I jump too far ahead, let me please bring in Mulatelo Mohale. Mulatelo, are you still with us? Let me see. You know, technology is so unpredictable. And in fact, when it's a bit overcast like this, we end up having very delayed network. Mulatelo, are you able to unmute and join the conversation? Let's see. Whilst you are trying, what I will do is just maybe take a minute or two to reflect on some inputs from the chat and some Q&As. Morag Swanapool in the Q&A says, what, if anything, is COGTA doing about this? I hope that our panelists are also thinking about the role players, the decision makers, who's responsible. In addition, I'm now looking in the chat, and one of our first comments is from, let me see, we have Midubi Shabangu, who notes that the post-liberation politics have redefined the role of the masses as the new currency, yes, for electoral politics post-1994. Hence, what one can call a codified relationship between traditional authorities and the ANC. What an accurate way of explaining what we have seen, the campaigning, the power relations, the blurred lines. Mudupi continues and says, more so, not even considering the historical role of chiefs who collaborated with apartheid. The question is it a lack of political will and/or enjoying the fruits of post-liberation pact between these governing and ruling classes in society? I'm wondering if there are any other questions or inputs. Yes, I'm just going to confirm for you, Baby Mahalidisa, our webinar is being streamed right now on our Facebook page. It will stay up there ideally for a very, very long time to come. So you will be able to reconnect if there were parts that you may have missed out and revisit, and you can definitely still post, questions much later, even if we're not in the space. I'm just trying to, yes, Mulatelo Mohale, I think you are with us. Let me ask you to unmute. I'm wondering if we can, yes, thank you so, so much, and over to you.
Yes, thank you. Sorry for that. We just had a power cut here. Thanks so much, comrades. I'll just draw from the presentation of my fellow panelists. They've mentioned one area that is very important, that government has been negligent in taking its role and responsibilities in the communal areas. And when that happens, you will find that people that are suffering the most are those ordinary people on the ground. And to the best of my knowledge, the land parcel in communal areas largely are owned by the state, particularly Department of Agriculture, Rural Development and Land Reform, but under custodianship of traditional leaders, except some parts in KZN. So normally what we see when government is not playing its role is that you'll find traditional leaders and communities at loggerheads over governance, related practices and accountability in rural areas. For example, you'll see in some areas where people are forced to pay tribal levies, irrespective of their status in the communities. Even if you are an orphan or you can afford tribal levies, you are forced to pay those tribal levies by the local practices. And in some areas, you'll find widowed women subjected to certain restrictions, such as movements. They can't go to work when their husband died. They can't scream or shout in the evening and so forth. So often when people are trying to be resilient, you'll find that there is a level of violence and abuse from those that think they are in power, because in practice, they reduce those ordinary people as occupiers, as opposed to people that have equal land rights to the traditional leaders. So, and the other issue is that when such illegal practices happens, there is a saying in my language that is very popular in the traditional leadership circle, that so you must always align your perspectives to the traditional leaders. If you are pushing a different agenda, you may as well leave their area, because they deem the communal land area as theirs and not someone else. So we also see when large-scale investment projects are introduced, you will find that only traditional leaders get consulted, because investors and the state feel like traditional leaders are the sole structures that can be consulted in such areas, leaving out people that will be affected by such large-scale investment projects outside of the process. And we're also seeing in some parts, especially in Limpopo, where land occupation is rife on private land owned by the CPAs. This is allegedly in some parts orchestrated by traditional leaders because they are in the periphery. Those farms are in the periphery of the so-called jurisdiction of traditional leaders. And organs of states such as municipalities, instead of being part of solving the problem, they will instead install basic services and not actually solving the issue that is at hand. So when people like I would say activists and people are resilient and also in those areas, you will find that the justice system is not fair, in a sense that people open criminal cases like theft and demolition of property, where the security structures of traditional leaders send them to demolish those houses because people are deemed
Hi, Mulatelo. I think we may have had a glitch. Please unmute and continue.
Sorry. Okay, thanks. I'm not sure where I got cut, comrade. Should I start from?
We're with you up to the abuse of power, opening criminal cases, demolishing people's properties, and the ways that traditional leaders or their affiliates, would behave when people resist.
Yes. So you'll find that in some cases, activists will take the legal route and seek support from the lawyers, that human rights lawyers, and take the matter to court. Like Nombuso mentioned, such judgments are not necessarily adhered to, because you'll find it's my view that it seems like government, investors, and traditional leaders speak the same language in exclusion of those that are deemed powerless in the communities. So I think the issue also lies with the government agencies and the Chapter 9 institutions, because they've got a role to play. I remember in 2018, there was a public hearing about Spluma in the province, where that public hearing was not a public hearing per se. It was an engagement of traditional leaders. So I happened to participate in that hearing, but then the traditional leaders were not impressed by the fact that this public hearing is taking place in the midst of them pushing government to consult with them separately outside the public platform. So during the discussion, they took a stance to say everyone in the house who is not a traditional leader need to go outside and leave traditional leaders to decide the fate of the public hearing. So we had to be outside in a sunny, under sunny conditions, and then wait for them to call us after an hour. And when we came back, they said the public hearing is postponed to a date that is not yet confirmed, only to find that they have made an agreement with the government to have a separate engagement that we won't be part of. Up until today, to the best of my knowledge, that public hearing has never happened again. So I think the other issue is that the department in question need to remind the traditional leaders that they also need to account not only to the state but to the people that they represent, and time and again take mandate from them, because they cannot represent people based on their perspective forever. So I think there is also a role in Chapter 9 institutions like your human rights to intervene and especially take on the aspect of human rights violation. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Muladelo, for those insights and inputs. And I'm, again, just really, reflecting on what happens to people who do resist, who do speak up, who do want to defend their basic rights. And the ways that people could be pushed into seeking, resolution in court is not because of even having money, because we're really talking about people who are a particular class in our society that is overlooked, even though there's more than like 18 million people in the former Bantustans whose tenure is not like in our legal framework secured beyond IPILRA, Interim Protection of Informal Land Rights Act. Still, though, people in the former Bantustans find themselves on the receiving end of these incredible abuses of power. And well, like you're saying, the questions really are, who else are we supposed to knock on the door or bring into the room for the conversation? And we do need more oversight. We do need more people to be eyes and ears and ensure, because we can't just entrust this to happen on its own. As much as you and other speakers have reflected, I'm thinking now of Nomboniso saying, they have been incredibly important and progressive traditional leaders and members of traditional authorities. But we cannot expect that that exception will become the rule. The reality is very different. And even some of the practices that are being upheld, the ones that Muladelo has reflected on, reminds me that traditional courts and the traditional courts bill saying in its current version, the one being debated in Parliament, that we wouldn't have an opt-out clause. And what does that look like for women? And I'm also thinking of other people who have spoken. I'm thinking immediately of Nolundu Luwaya, who always says, your geography in South Africa does determine the kind of country you live in. And I'm thinking I could be right now in this city having access to legal services and protections. And as soon as I go and visit any of our family homes in a rural area, immediately then I'm becoming a second-class citizen. But not to steer the debate away from the people who have joined us. We have some more comments and inputs. I hope that the speakers were able to take note of the earlier insights, the role of COCTA, realizing how closely traditional authorities and the ANC's relationship has really, really, really been cemented over the years. And could we expect the same policy interventions from people who have benefited really from this symbiotic relationship? I will now look back at the chat and the Q&A just to ensure that I haven't missed anyone's inputs. And then I will let our panelists just reflect on some of what you've said. It is in the chat, but in case you're joining on our Facebook Live and you can't see our chat, we have one comment coming from Lady Matlake saying, traditional leaders are colluding with politicians to sell community land without consent of broader communities. We witness mushrooming of settlements in agricultural fields of farmers without consulting the farmers, and bribing traditional leaders is happening on a large scale. And Milady's giving an example around the Mpumalanga Bushbuck Ridge area where you have seen the way that settlements have become really densely populated. And I see another comment coming from Midupi Shabangu, thank you, saying unaccountable and undemocratic nature of most of these institutions will remain a challenge to democratize communal land space and dismantle patriarchy. And Midupi goes on to say that Limpopo once had the Ralushai Commission investigating traditional leadership claims and contestations under then Premier Wako Ramotlhodi's administration. And Prof. Ralushai was sworn to secrecy about the findings to then Premier, indicated that most of the traditional leaders aligned to the ANC after 94 might not have been the legitimate leaders. And that is, Midupi goes on to say, my conclusion is that we might not see any significant movement from government side. So I think some of these thoughts and reflections are there to say, yes, we've got to be cognizant of who truly benefits from this kind of chaotic situation we're in right now. I'm just going to go to one more Q&A. I see Baby Machiledisa saying, why does our ancestral land have to be politicized? Our great-grandfathers worked together in peace and has community and had humanity amongst one another, but that has totally changed. So that's it really, is that we don't romanticize the past and say that societies always got along and there was no conflict or moments of dissent. What we are saying though is that that political focus has put pressure on people living in these areas, on people who are administering land on behalf of communities. And I'm just gonna take one comment that I actually got on my phone saying a few weeks ago, Controlesa in KwaZulu came out quite boldly to say that they want to form their own government. And I'm now going to quote Chairperson for Controlesa KwaZulu, Inkosi Thulasizwe its own structures of government, especially on remuneration and security arrangements. And we know that there's been, that history of the Ndunas KwaZulu, not all of whom had been paid for a period. Please do just flag me if I'm going too quickly. David Ramohanwe is coming in also on the issue of, the exceptionalism of KwaZulu, saying where, yes, that's in fact the reflection that David gave me on the phone. And Morag Swanepoel saying one has to do things in spite of government. They're not capable and and maybe quite biased. So thank you so much for bringing, your voice and your inputs into the room virtually. I'd like to just give a chance to some of our panelists to jump in there. Ayanda, Nomboniso Mulatelo. Ayanda, could I start with you?
Thanks, Tepa, thank you very much. So I fully agree and, concur with the notions that have been raised by people on the chat group. The questions, the concerns that have been raised are really, what we're currently dealing with. And I think for me, the moment that, if I can put it this way, the moment that the traditional leadership system became politicized, that's where problems began, because now you find government appointing traditional leaders, which is what, I thought, we sought to do away with the introduction of, the new regime, the constitution, and that's part of the arguments that we bringing, for instance, in some of these traditional leadership cases, where we say it cannot be that government can impose a traditional leader on a community, because that is the same system that was used during the apartheid era. I mean, as things stand, government appoints the traditional leader, they pay, they remunerate the traditional leader. But if you look at the past and how things used to work in the past, it would be the community that would appoint their traditional leader. In fact, the community would take care of their traditional leaders, and they didn't have to be, remunerated by government. And so the interest of the traditional leader would obviously be then towards his or her community, as opposed to, you know, their funder now, if I could put it in that way, which is government. And what we've also sought to demonstrate through these cases is communities have always had their own dispute resolution mechanisms, in terms, you know, taking into account their customary law processes. I mean, if you look, for instance, in the Amampondo case, for instance, they had their own way of resolving disputes, and they would even invite traditional leaders in surrounding areas to help them resolve a dispute. And so the notion that government has to come in from above and determine a dispute, or determine who is the rightful king and not the rightful king, then is a bit, you know, it's problematic, and it does not then, you know, move away from the apartheid type of system, which would come in and impose a traditional leader on communities. That then trickles down into then the issue of traditional leaders feeling that they need to own the land, and they need to enter into agreements with private companies, or, you know, to try and benefit from that. And then it just, you know, it trickles all the way down from what I've said to, you know, traditional leaders feeling that they should own the land and that they should own all the resources. So I think for me, really, that's where the problem starts. Thanks, Tebo.
Thank you very much, Ayanda. I'd like to then bring in Mulatelo, and I'm wondering if you might touch on Morag Swanepoel's question around COGTA. Do they have any role here? What is happening? Because of the way you have explained the immediate ways that we see that people who are not born into these families are really disregarded.
Yeah, thanks, Tepo. Yes, I think COGTA has a role to play. And I think apart from just building those 5-star traditional council premises, they have got more to do to actually address issues that affect people, not only to be seen as supporting traditional leadership structures in the midst of all these violence and abusive practices that people normally mention. And I think it's too soon for Department of Agriculture, Rural Development and Land Reform to just dump ownership of land in communal land to the traditional leadership without actually capacitating those structures and ensuring those structures are democratic and also considerate to the realities of people in the rural settings. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Mulatelo. So now I'm going to circle back to, you know, our conversation starter, Nomboniso. Specifically, it's a comment that we had offline and now shared by Constance Mkhale, who is the national coordinator for ARD, saying, what would be the immediate strategic action for us as the ARD, the pressure points, what is it that we can now do, realizing this is the direction we're going in? Nobody, so are you still with us? I know technology can be very uncertain some days.
So we spoke a bit about it today in this discussion, about how government doesn't really respect decisions of courts, or doesn't necessarily abide by those decisions. So what are we going to do? Somebody else said we should not focus only on on launching legal cases. I think we can do a number of things, including continuing with the strategy of pursuing the courts. Firstly, I think it's important for activists and communities, especially, to refocus the debate, the communal land debate, and the land debate as in general as political. We need to reinsert it as a political conversation that has to take place between South Africans and those who make policies and govern us. So if we restate the politics in this debate, of course, it does not mean that we pursue party political, factional politics. I think we need to find a way of creating a platform. And I don't know, I haven't been following a lot of the work that ARD is doing, but I think it's important to strengthen the ties that you have with other organizations, and to put up a political platform. And that political platform should be basically recalibrate and refocus the land debate as political, as touching the communal land debate, as touching between government and the constitution and the people of this country. Because it is, even though it's obvious to us and it's visible because people live it, those we love and our families live it, but it affects, yes, it affects a third of South African citizens, but most of those citizens are very poor and they live in marginalized communities in rural areas. So your kind of mainstream debate tends to miss it. So we need to bring it into the center of public discourse in South Africa. The second issue is that my conversations with people have tended to say that, look, we don't want to talk about communal land because really that's about culture and African culture and so on and so forth. And we don't really want to step on people's toes. So I think it's important that we crystallize what the issues are for ourselves, for the people that we work with, for the communities, but also find a way of reaching out to those who are very influential in this country, including the mainstream media, which is not very keen on doing work sometimes. So that's the first thing, restating this as political. The second issue that I think is important is to crystallize and bring a summary of all the stunning work that has been done by communities, by activists, by organizations, and by academics who have been part of this. So if ARD were interested in pursuing this, you could in fact look at the high-level panel and the recommendations of the high-level panel and see how you pull them out of the websites and bring them to people. There are a number of ways in which you can do this. You can prepare, okay, you've got the fact sheets from Custom Contested and those kinds of publications, but you can also prepare talking points, small podcast points, voice notes and so on that you can use in community radios especially, and others. But the point is that you use the media that people use and you restate some of these issues. Okay, what is communal land about? How do you secure people's tenure of their land without necessarily discarding some of the attractive aspects of it that don't necessarily reduce it to property? What kind of protections could exist besides what people tend to think is the obvious, which is a private title deed? The conversations around that would be very important if you were to link up with activists in different areas, because with technology now, it's easier to talk to people. So you have TikTok is 2 minutes. So you could use TikTok. You have an ARD channel on TikTok. You come up with a creative way of putting these issues across for people, so that we are not only talking about these things in conferences and in academic halls. We actually are talking about them, with people who can also. You can have a TikTok competition, for example, that says, put up videos of what you think about communal land tenure, so your own experiences, all of this. The policy platform, I think it's important to have a policy platform. If you're restating these things as political, you look at what are the options for communal land tenure. What would it mean to make decisions? If government says they will give land to traditional councils to administer, what does that mean? And why is that problematic? Or how could, all of those kinds of conversations. The truth of the matter is that we talk a lot about politicians who do not care and so on. But I think that the truth of the matter is that the ANC, especially, there are no new ideas that are going to come out of the ANC, whether we like it or not. And so far, it is the ruling party. There are no new ideas that are going to come out of the ANC. There are no new ideas that are going to come out of the DA. There are no new ideas that are going to come out of Action South Africa. There are no new ideas that are going to come out of EFF and all these parties. EFF talks about land at the level of rhetoric. But if you were to say, let's interrogate how people live in rural communities, how people are affected by this insecure tenure, how does it manifest? What is people's relationship with land? How do you protect that dynamism and so on? So I think it's important to come up with that policy platform. I think also ARD and those who want to see this change need to start thinking about what are the principles that bind us as we talk about communal land tenure. If we say that communal land tenure protects all rights, all intersecting rights, your rights at a family level in terms of land, at a communal level, all these intersecting rights, how does that look like? So we have to come up with these broad policy principles to say it cannot be a communal land tenure that is secure if it excludes this, that, and da. So we need to come up with those kinds of principles. All of this, incidentally, we could build from the high-level panel report, because the high-level report panel report actually is very detailed. So we can draw some of those issues there. We could also say, whilst there are all these issues about the status of traditional leaders and how they hold, what holding for them means and so on, we could say that, well, for now, upgrade IPILRA to make sure that, IPILRA, at least it becomes permanent. So you don't have to have this regular renewal and so on. So such a policy platform, which includes all, some of these things that I've highlighted, but also more than that, I'm sure. Such a policy platform could be, in fact, your launch of a renewed campaign in this space. And you could build slowly to it. And as you go to 2024 elections, you could have it and say the political parties that understand these issues are the political parties that people should vote for. So, there are different ways in which you can do that. The most important thing is that such a campaign is not exclusive of traditional leaders. Can invite them. You can undertake such overtures and all of that, because there are traditional leaders who want to be part of it. There are other things that, that we can draw again from the high-level panel, from the presidential report, commission report, from the work that people have done. What are the components of a communal land tenure policy and bill that would be unacceptable? How do you go about that? So those are some of the things that we could raise, what to look out for. And then we need to talk about the process. So I come from what these children today call arthritis Twitter. So I'm old, and I'm come from an era where feminists taught us to emphasize the process and the product. And they argue that the process by which the process that you undertake has an impact on the product that you end up with. The Constitutional Court has redefined that very nicely and talked about public participation, meaningful participation, and an engagement with people. So we could also talk about what the process would, what a process would look like that would envisage for this. Section 25 talks about community or person. So that means each and every person that is affected in those communities needs to make a decision. It has to be informed. All these judgments have built on that and say you have to be prior informed consent, not only about a decision that has to be made, but also how your land is going to be used. So all of these deepen our understanding of what consultation means, what participation means. And then answering the question that was raised, what is COCTA's, what does COCTA do? COCTA is doing nothing about this. The interesting thing at the Communal Land Tenure Summit was that the minister of COCTA was there, the minister and the head deputy minister. When it was time for her to speak, she made no mention of any overview or any kind of work that COCTA is doing to ensure that traditional councils are properly constituted, that they abide by the law and all of that. None of that. So one of the issues that are important is to actually tackle this thing head on and say that, when I cornered one traditional leader in the corridors, and I said to him, but how do you even call where did this notion that land must be transferred to you? You know it's not your land. And then he says, yeah. Look, we can discuss that. But right now, government has told us that they're going to transfer this land to us, not for us, but to administer. So that's a myth. That's a myth that administering land is not the same as maybe taking all sorts of privileges as if you own it. We know from our experiences that are well documented that a lot of traditional councils that have made decisions are not necessarily owning. They know that they don't own that land, but the way in which administering and ownership and custodianship have been blurred, those lines, it means that it no longer makes any difference. And that's why some traditional leaders say, okay, once we don't have a conversation that is clear, decided about ownership and transferring of the title to us, at least they can give us that land to administer at this point. And we need to have conversation about that. Firstly, that administration by traditional councils has often not made any difference between administration and ownership. Key decision making has relied with the traditional leaders who use traditional councils as rubber stamp. So we need to be very clear, we need to have a conversation about that. Secondly, we also need to have a conversation about how a lot of traditional councils are in fact divided, and that adds to conflict, it foments conflict in communities. So what would be the principles And we have to put COGTA on the spot and argue that COGTA has to respond to questions about what they are doing about traditional councils to capacitate them so that when they make these decisions, they know what they're talking about, that they are aware of the oversight and accountability to communities. 3, who accounts for funding and all of that. I mean, what was interesting at the Communal and Tenure Summit was that Hoshi Pilani, who was representing Contralesa, is in fact in conflict with his own community. In that multi-billion conflict with his community, he has spent, the commission found, he has spent 12 million in court cases against the people who own that money. So we need to be, we need to get into some of these difficult issues. And then the basis of that can be for campaigns. I don't know if you have the energy, the resources, and the reach to have a shutdown, a national shutdown on communal land, but it would be something that you want, that we might want to consider, where one section of the Constitution has been totally ignored, and what are the implications of that? The implications of that can come in your small TikTok videos and other videos, where for 2 seconds people talk about how their land is insecure, how the court decided that Ingonyama Trust should refund people. The minister went on TV and everywhere and said they would make sure that that was done, but it has not been done. Also, the fact that the community was left to ask international funders and donors to help them, when in fact government should have stepped in and said to Ingonyama Trust, but you can't do this. So roughly, Connie, those are some of my very unrefined ideas, but basically it's about building on the work that has been done. There's stellar work that has been done in this field, and we need to find a way of popularizing it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nomboniso, for those insights and inputs. And some of those are really actionable, interventions. And I know that the ARD will also be attending in about 2 weeks' time, the failed tenure conference that's being convened by PLAS, LARC, LRC, SWAP. I'm sure some of you may have already seen the invites going out on social media. I hope you'll definitely register, log in, join us virtually, because this isn't a conversation that would end today. I really enjoyed the input saying there may not be any new ideas coming from political parties. So let's put them to terms. Let's let them know what we want, what we demand, and be as political, because we can't escape how political land is. We are not going to ever get over the fact that the land question is the question that we need to answer. And we, people who live and work in communal areas and with people who have rights in these areas, are saying it's not enough. Just to reflect on some of the inputs that have come in from the chat, people have reflected on, the ownership, people who had, areas where they've been outright purchase of land, and then you find maybe that process gets hijacked by traditional authorities. Then the interplay between land, minerals, property rights, I suppose even water reform, how important it is as well. I see the input from Mutlana Lulebebe saying we do need to bring COGTA on board also because of the role that they play in municipalities. And yet municipalities tend to be this island away from land reform. And just so many other really insightful inputs. We will be very happy to put a copy of our chat up on our social media pages, just in case we never got through to everyone's comments. David Ramohanwe and Lebohang were even mentioning how important it is for us to engage traditional councils, but also to say we're not happy with the 60-40 split. We don't feel like that would be a good reflection of our communities and decision-making, and making sure that we are saying we want and we demand much, much more. And thank you again to every single person who has joined the conversation. I hope you won't feel that I did you an injustice if I didn't specifically go through your comment, but they are all really important and you've kept this conversation alive. As the ARD, we're going to go into action mode. We also know that in like about 2 weeks, LAMOSA will be holding their AGM. And we know that LAMOSA had been, you know, really at the forefront of fighting for restitution in the Concord. So this conversation isn't happening in a vacuum. There is lots of things happening around us that tells us we need to recalibrate, as Nomboniso is saying, recenter, refocus, come back to who we are and what it is that we actually want, and many other really actionable items, taking information to people, reaching youth, making things accessible, bringing many people into the room for conversations, and where we find allies working alongside them. And we may find many allies in this conversation who wouldn't be people we would normally think to, you know, approach or align with. So I think it's also saying to us, beyond activism, just in a practical sense, bring this conversation out there. Because what's not nice is, you might have seen, if you're in, you know, our audience, that, you know, some members of civil society organizations find themselves under attack and people worry about the way and then think that means you can remove the conversation, what I want to say, from something as silly as the inflection in my voice or how someone else presents, you know, themselves. And so we're saying as civil society, specifically people who are in this space, that we live and work this reality. And it is the shame that we have to go out there for funding and protection, when in fact the state should have been the first to safeguard these rights for us. And it is incredible to realize that the state has made that decision on its own, that it would at times be okay to come up against us, to label us, to call us names, to have sometimes people being intimidated. Human rights defenders have spoken over and over about this. And it's really just to say that these conversations aren't happening alone. They're not isolated. And I feel really like this conversation we've had this afternoon has helped us to think big and small. And I hope you can locate yourself in that conversation and that you'll feel inspired to continue the work, whether you're in civil society or outside of it, but just participating, being in our country, having a say on what happens, how it happens, and what we think, and reflecting, like our speakers have said, on our lived experiences and realities. With that, I want to once again just thank all of our guests who joined us online, and also those who will later log on to our Facebook and catch up on the conversation, and very much to thank our panelists, our conversation starters, Ayanda Ngubo, Mulatelo Mohale, and Nomboniso Kasa. In the coming weeks, we will of course share publicly our discussion paper that was penned by Nomboniso because we commissioned her to help us to kickstart this conversation. So please don't tire of joining us and being part of these conversations. Thank you so much and good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.